full governance structure and issues, and also wrote his thesis on regional and local property tax equity. For the past 12 years, he's run Style Woodworking, a small business with with both full and part-time employees manufacturing furniture and household items. As founder of Stop the Spray BC, he has also advocated against cloth. Thank you. Spraying regional forests, and this makes him makes them more prone to fire and less supportive of wildlife. Please help me welcome James.
All right, thanks you guys. Thanks for having me.
Over here.
Oh, over here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering where I could pick the thing. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Kelsey. That was awesome. I kind of came up with a name today. It's called Pine Plantations in the Era of Megafires and Declining Moose. And I think, you know, a lot of times we get hung up on the herbicides, but I think we need to step back and look at kind of the big picture of what we're doing to the forests, which is converting a lot of our primary forests into basically pine plantations. This article here, okay, how do we get the, how do I go forward? Oh, the space bar. So this story here is from 6 years ago. This is kind of a bit of an infamous argument I made about how all the spraying is the reason why 40% of the recovered moose south of Prince George died of apparent starvation. A lot of people disagreed with that. They said, well, we didn't actually spray that much out there. And I think it kind of lost sight of the big picture, which is we're not growing forests like this out there. Okay, so this is just down the hill from here. This is Ginter's Green or the Cranbrook Escarpment, whatever you want to call it. This is prime moose habitat right around the university here. You can walk through the trails down the hill. That's what moose like. This is the bottom of the hill. In Ginter's Green, see all the aspen there, all the Douglas maple. There's probably some red osier dogwood in there. Actually, I just learned that the original place name of Cranbrook Hill in DeKalb was the dwarf maple ridge. So dwarf maple meaning Douglas maple. And for Douglas maple to grow, you need birch and aspen. That's what Douglas maple grows under. It doesn't grow under a pure conifer forest. This is an aspen forest south of Prince George. So, you know, it's not just moose that like the aspen. It's actually aspen forests are the hotspot for small mammals in interior forests. They're the hotspot for bird diversity, insect diversity, vascular plant diversity. They provide a huge amount of services to watershed capacity. I'll get into a little bit if I have enough time, and hopefully you guys will shut me down when I go over 15 minutes because we could go on for a while. But this is what we're growing out there. Okay, this is a pine plantation southwest of Stewart Lake. My friend Monica Buchanan took that photo, but you could drive down the Blackwater Road, you'll see the same thing. You could drive up to Chief Lake, you'll see the same thing. You know, if it's a reforested stand from the last 30 years, it's probably more likely than not going to look like this. When you get into the higher elevations in the wet belt, it might be more of a spruce plantation, but across huge areas of the interior, all the way down to the American border, pine trees are what we're growing a lot of. And of course, this is what we call sustainable forest management. We have other fancy words for it, ecosystem-based management. So we use these fancy words to basically justify an even-aged, low-browse, low biodiversity pine plantation. So how are we doing this? Well, we plant a lot of pine trees. This is from a presentation by Suzanne Simard. It's called The Trouble with Pine. If you look that up online, you'll see her presentation. It's more in the cedar hemlock zone, kind of near Salmon Arm where this research was done. But I think these are provincial numbers. So we plant a lot of pine and then we plant some spruce too. And I've tree planted for a few years, actually on and off for 20 years. And in a place where I grew up, so I actually got to look at what I planted in the late 90s. And I know for a fact we planted like 40% spruce, and you won't see 40% spruce now, 20 years later. It's like 100% pine. So the spruce doesn't really like to grow all that much. They're slow to grow. Douglas fir, a lot of the fir that we planted died out in the exposed clear cuts. And the pine does great, right? The pine loves clear cuts. So if you plant 60% pine, they take off, they explode, and then you end up with pine domination. Also, it helps that pine's really cheap to grow in a nursery. So Douglas fir costs 4 times as much to grow in a nursery as pine trees. There's no legal requirement to replant fir, right? So if you log 100% Douglas fir forest, there's no legal requirement to regrow Douglas fir. So the incentive is to grow pine, cheap, easy, quick to get off the books, right? So there's a thing called free growing, where any company that logs a place, they're obligated to reforest it within a certain amount of time. What's the easiest, cheapest tree to do? Pine. So that's what we do. And then after the pine trees are planted, you get competition, quote unquote. The aspen, the birch, the willow grows. So about 10 years after planting, we go in and do this. We haven't done a lot of this in the last 3 years, but we do manual brushing. So we cut a lot of the aspen down now with brush saws. And we kind of forget that spruce can grow under this stuff. Douglas fir can grow under aspen. Right, so when you get rid of the aspen, you just basically help the pine out. So then the pine do better. You lose out on your uneven age potential of the plantation, because if you left the aspen trees, it would take longer, but your spruce would come in under there. So then in 40 years, you're gonna have like a really diverse mixed forest with different age classes, different species. It's gonna be more resilient to insects. It's gonna be more resilient to stress. There's all sorts of studies proving that. But we get rid of the aspen, the pine take off, and we do it everywhere. Okay, so here's a map of all the historical brushing and spraying around British Columbia. The drier places, we don't have to brush and spray as much, but in a moister ecosystem like around Prince George, we do a lot of it, right? So around Prince George is just a hot spot of spraying. This is southwest of Prince George. This is where 40% of the recovered moose died of starvation. And people dispute this, that, you know, the amount of herbicide spraying, like I mentioned, is small, but you know, it's a large percentage of the moose habitat that we go after. So the aspen might only be 20% of a cut block, but we spray 100% of that 20%. And another thing that we're not looking at is how, if you look at the government's moose, the quality moose habitat map, it's where the majority of the spraying happens, because what they call quality moose habitat is where there's lots of deciduous browse, where it's wetter enough for deciduous browse. That's exactly the areas that we spray and brush. So when you go further to the west, it gets drier. There's not as much quality moose browse. They don't have to brush and spray as much. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22. Now, the big argument why we're doing this is because, well, we got to replace what we took, right? We logged all these pine forests. So we just got to replace the pine trees, right? We need to replace what we took. And I just want to talk about this a little bit, because there's really important details that are kind of missed out in this really simplified narrative. And that is that a lot of these pine stands that were like 40, 50% pine that got hit with the pine beetle, you know, they were actually on this really complex, not simple trajectory, successional trajectory that probably was most likely was leading away from pine in the long term. And the Beck zone map kind of clarifies that pretty well. So this is the biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system for British Columbia. And if you look around Prince George, all that purple, that's subboreal spruce. Okay, so we're in a subboreal spruce ecosystem. There's little patches of Douglas fir and stuff mixed in. But basically the ultimate climax forest around here is going to be spruce, not pine. So the only like kind of spruce ecosystem is that light blue area. Which, you know, but if you look at what we're reforesting, we're doing pine everywhere. So here's a place that was hit with the pine beetle pretty hard. You can't really tell because I take firewood out of here, but it was probably 40% pine. And what's happening wasn't, you know, we didn't clear cut it, we didn't spray it. So what's happening is we're getting spruce and aspen growing. So aspen's almost acting like a climax forest as well, which isn't recognized by that Beck map, but you get aspen and spruce growing where it used to be pine. So we're not replacing what we took, right? This is what we took. It's something that's on the way to something totally different. And basically we reversed it and forced it to go back to a pine stand. So we're losing out on all this complexity, all this diversity. This one's I find really interesting because this was a pure pine place with a very little aspen in it. The pine beetle took all the pine out, and now we have aspen growing. So this one, the aspen, is the climax forest, which is an important point to make, because a lot of times we argue that the aspen is just some kind of weed that, you know, grows for 20 years. And then we can get rid of it and there's no impact on the long-term landscape ecosystem. But in reality, aspen all the time is a climax forest, not all the time, but a lot of the times, where it might be aspen indefinitely. If you look at old historical maps of Prince George around South Fort George Park, like that was an aspen forest back then. Probably this hillside as well, like back to the original DeKalb place name, where this was, you know, the Dwarfshire Bridge, probably meant that it was an aspen ridge. There's places south of Prince George where I grew up that are aspen for as long as anybody can remember. So it's important to recall that they don't always, it's not always just simple successional dynamic where you have aspen for 30 years and everything naturally reverts back to conifer. That's not the way our forests work, but that's exactly how we're treating them as far as reforestation and landscape management. The end result of which is that we almost certainly have more pine on the landscape now than we did when we had the pine beetle, particularly on those reforested cut blocks. So just a few examples. This is south of Prince George. This was spruce, Douglas fir, pine, aspen, cottonwood, birch. You can look on the forest in the background there, that's still all alive, green fir. That's meaning that's what this mostly was. Okay, this is a year after it got sprayed. This is what it looks like now. All those aspen died. That aspen patch is no longer, there's no aspen growing in there. It's toast. There's some birch growing back from seed, but the aspen's history. There's a bit of spruce where that aspen was, but that whole hillside is all pine. This is before they sprayed it on the Blackwater Road. Notice that little wildlife retention patch on the top right corner. Okay, that all got sprayed. They oversprayed that too. This is about 9 years after being sprayed. So the aspen has been decimated. A lot of the yellow there you see is actually alder. So we've totally changed the trajectory of that forest. Here's a really cool example. This is south of Bobtail Lake on the Grizzly Road. So all the big change in reforestation happened in the 1980s, where we basically privatized forest management. Before 1987, the province was responsible for reforesting, and the government's usually bad at things. And luckily we were bad at reforesting. Well, they tried, you know, they would plant, but they never sprayed as much. So once we privatized it, the companies are like, let's spray the crap out of everything. That started in 1987. So this is kind of pre-1987. This is government-run reforestation on the left there, logged in 1972. They did a bunch to it. I think they went in there like 3 times. They broadcast burned it. They planted it. But regardless, it kind of dominated. It came back mostly aspen in parts of it. But if you walk through there, it's actually an awesome forest. There's aspen in there. There's spruce. There's there's 5 species of trees in a good number. There's moose in there. There's cattle grazing in there. This place here was logged in 1989, sprayed 2 times, and it's just like pure pine trees. So you can really see what happened with the trajectory of the forest there just in this image. This is closer to home if you want to investigate stuff. This is just south of Baldy Hughes. This place in the back, we can't really see it, but that was logged in the 70s. There's a little bit of manual brushing. So when you go past Baldy Hughes on the Blackwater Road, you'll drive through that area and you can see what kind of a reforested place should look like with a lighter touch silvicultural hand, you could say. But here is the place on the right-hand side that was sprayed in 1990. Few little areas they missed, but it's like mostly, it's almost 100% pine. The one right beside it on the left, they haven't sprayed it yet. That might be because that company is one of the companies that doesn't spray. So there's good companies and bad companies. I don't want to name names right now, but some companies don't really spray at all. And they hit all their free growing targets. So it's also important to note that you can actually have a lot of deciduous mixed in with your cut block and still hit your free to grow target. So a lot of forestry culture is to go beyond, over and above what's required and do excessive spraying, excessive brushing, places that you don't need to brush. According to the regulations, they brush it anyway, because it's free money. Basically, it's your money that they spend doing that. So, and nobody keeps track. So they can waste their money, nobody cares, and they get away with it. Oh, it's seized up on us here. Let's see if that works. Okay, so why do we do it? And basically, well, a lot of it's unnecessary, but I think the mindset is the faster that we can get the plantations growing, the more we can log today. Okay, so it's a bit of a numbers game. The faster you can get the trees to grow, it'll feed into the computer model, the TIPSY growth and yield model. And the higher the annual allowable cut can be. Okay, so the concern is if we didn't spray, if we didn't brush, if we let these aspen trees grow, that's going to cut into our bottom line today. So that's why there's this big hesitancy to change these practices, is because we think it's going to reduce the amount we can log. Now, here's the government rationale right off their website. You can just go to the last sentence there. If forest managers do not practice vegetation management, the resulting wood loss will have serious consequences for the future economy of BC. So this is like pretty serious stuff here, right? But it's not working. We got mills shutting down left, right, and center. We don't have to talk about that too much here. We know all about it. Our workforce, forestry workforce is being decimated, right? It went from 79,000 workers to 44,000 workers. Because we've had a lot of mill shutdowns. It's not just mill shutdowns, it's automation, it's heavy iron in the bush, right? You're replacing hand fallers with big feller bunchers that can do the work of like 50 people with one person. And then, and we blame the fire and the pine beetles, right? That's the big reason why these, while these mills are shutting down. Mind you, we're still logging pretty much as we've always logged, but we're shutting mills down because of projections that stuff hasn't come online yet, right? So the pine beetle and the fires, the impact of that is still down the road. So we're just kind of anticipating that. We're shutting down the pulp mills now because we know the wood's not going to be there. But what are we blaming it on? We're blaming it on pine beetles and forest fires. Okay, so how do you make those two things worse? And climate change. That headline says climate, fires, and beetles. What makes that worse? Covering the landscape in fire-prone, low biodiversity pine plantations. So we're learning nothing, right? We're making the problem worse. All the reasons why we're losing our economy, forest economy, we're just setting it up for greater failure. This is off the government website. So the one on the left there, that's a threatened plantation, right? With all that broadleaf in there. The one on the right is after treatment, it's free growing. But which one's threatened here? Which one's threatened by fire? Which one's threatened by climate change? Which one's threatened by insect infestations? It's the one on the right, right? So, but we think that's sustainable forestry. So it's this fundamental contradiction that is kind of what I always hammering on about, and what I don't think we're really reckoning with in forestry, in government, possibly in academia. So it's pretty well established that aspen burns less than conifer. There's debate and misinformation around that as well, but generally aspen will burn slower. Well, not generally, it's almost always the case under every set of conditions. If aspen is burning, the conifer is going to be burning hotter and quicker. In summertime, when the aspen is leafed out, and if there's healthy aspen, most likely it can stop the fire. It can really reduce the intensity of that fire, at least, like bring it into an understory kind of low intensity ground fire. So here's a study they did up in Northwest Territories, a lot of wind, extreme fire conditions, dry. It hit that aspen plot and it stopped the fire. This is the bobtail burn, the plantation burnt, hit the aspen, it stopped. This is the field guide to the Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System. Green aspen there's no red on it. That means it's fairly fire resistant, doesn't burn much. Leafless aspen, so springtime fires and aspen is a thing, but it's still not as much as conifer. The one in the middle here, that's 75% aspen. It's pretty flammable. So you need those 100% pure aspen stems. That's exactly what we get rid of on the plantations. That's what we're spraying, that's what we're brushing. Here's an aspen forest that acted as a fire break in the Northwest Territories. So this is leafless aspens, this is the most flammable aspen. You'll see that the rate of spread is like 5 times higher in the black spruce. So even in those conditions, the aspen is still a benefit. You still want the aspen, even when it can burn. This study, you can check it out. It's basically they did a 36-year study of what forest type burnt in northern Alberta, and the white spruce burnt about 340% more area than aspen. The pine burnt 840% more land area, and the spruce burnt black spruce burnt 1,000% more land area. So if you want to reduce your probability of fire on the landscape, we need more aspen. We need all the aspen we can get. We shouldn't be cutting down a single stem of it. But we do that all the time in places that have burnt. So I've gone into some of these forest fire areas and I've looked at the brushing history. Which, by the way, you can't do this in Alberta because the government doesn't keep track of what they've sprayed. There's no maps in Alberta of what they've sprayed, so nobody can research it. Nobody can do studies on it. But we find here, this is by Kamloops. Some of these blocks have been brushed like 5 times. Anyway, fire is one thing. Also, if you have more aspen, your watershed's going to perform way better in drought. Aspen trees absorb more moisture, they absorb more snow. There's less interception in the canopy. So here's the same day photo, for example. This is late April. There's way more snow under the aspen. All the snow's gone under the conifer. That's because 40% of the snowfall doesn't even make it to the forest floor in conifer, it just stays in the needles, gets sublimated. They've done studies in Japan. It's something we haven't really done in Canada. We don't compare aspen to deciduous or aspen to conifer in Canada, like there's very few studies on this. If anybody in the university is looking for some research projects, that's I think some fertile ground. So in Japan, they compared the watershed function under a conifer forest compared to a deciduous forest. And these are some of the findings. Runoff discharge was higher in deciduous. Basically, the last sentence of this is deciduous broadleaf forests are better able to foster water resources and to control flooding than evergreen coniferous forests. This is a study out of Colorado showing rainfall interception. So there's pretty much 0 rainfall loss in the canopy in aspen forests. So all your precipitation that's happening makes it to the forest floor in aspen. That's why probably one of the reasons it doesn't burn all that much. Another reason why it's good to have on your landscape if drought is a thing, right? Because it'll utilize the scarce water resources more effectively. Here's some quotes you could go back into, but this is from the United States. They do a lot of research in aspen down there. They like their aspen. Beaver as well, that's like a main food for beaver, right? So if you have aspen in your cut blocks, you're gonna have beaver habitat, beaver are gonna move in, they're gonna build dams, you're gonna have beaver dams, which has all sorts of ecological benefits. And of course, it can help stop fires. So there's been a lot of research in the States where beaver dams are linked with reduction of loss for wildfires. The headline says highest carbon sequestration. So not only do we reduce the fires, not only do we increase your watershed capacity, you also sequester way more carbon. These aspen trees and the birch and the cottonwood, they're the best carbon sequestering tree we have in our forests. And that's there hasn't been a study that found the opposite. This report from Alaska found that after a forest fire, the aspen and birch sucked up 500% more carbon than the spruce, the black spruce. And once it was mature, because they grow faster, right? But once it's mature, it's 160% more carbon. So if you want to sequester the most carbon, we should be growing deciduous. And we should also be charging softwood industry carbon tax for their war on aspen because they're costing us carbon. That's a carbon cost. They should be paying for that. And then of course, this might even be the most important thing, the albedo effect, right? So what absorbs way more sunlight? Dark conifer. This is the only study that's ever been done on forest albedo in Canada. And they found that aspen conifer absorb 180% more sunlight than deciduous. So we all know that when you walk on a pavement when you're a kid, you walk on the white line because you're not going to burn your foot, right? Same principle on the forest. There was a study they did in Europe that just the European conversion from broadleaf to conifer was equivalent to 6% of fossil fuel burnt up to 2018. Like these are significant numbers. That's from this study. So managed forests contribute to warming just from the albedo effect. We're not talking about forest fires. We're not talking about carbon sequestration, just from the albedo. How are we doing for time? Am I going late here? So basically, anyway, I could wrap it up now, or I could go on a little bit more, but in conclusion, the annual allowable cut maximization, which is the reason we're spraying and brushing everything, and why we're growing pine plantations, is not working, right? It hasn't created more jobs, hasn't helped the industry. It's actually created more flammable forests. It's undermined climate change. It's undermined biodiversity. It's undermined all sorts of other industries that nobody talks about, like cattle ranching, right? Aspen forests support way more cattle than pine plantations. That's kind of my background, and they just destroyed the public rangeland out in Punshaw, south of here. So yeah, anyway, the point is deciduous always wins. That's it. We need every stick of deciduous out there. You know, it can help mitigate the impacts of climate change, and it can also help reduce climate change if we let it. So thanks for listening, guys.
So next up, we have two presenters. First is Juliet Gouveia. Pretty close. Shoot, how do I pronounce it? Gouveia. Gouveia, darn. Okay, Juliet Gouveia. Juliet is a seasoned forester and RPF with over a decade of experience in the natural resources sector. Boasts a career spanning more than 7 years in Canada and over 3 years in Central America. As a forester, she adeptly combines business development, silviculture, and carbon management skills to generate value for her clients and stakeholders. In her professional capacity, Juliet identifies and presents opportunities for community engagement, disaster response, and ecological and forestry initiatives. She also oversees the implementation and monitoring of projects focused on carbon sequestration and ecosystem restoration, particularly in landscapes affected by wildfires and beetle infestations. Juliet is dedicated to enhancing environmental, social, and economic values associated with the land. And next up, we have Jason Fisher. I said that right?
Fisher. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you. With over 25 years of experience in the natural resources sector, Jason helps clients who are exploring or engaged in forestry and sustainable resource management, policy development, and impact assessment, as well as community and government relations. His services include strategic planning, assessment, and communications and policy. He works with governments, forestry and bioenergy companies, Indigenous communities and enterprises, and businesses seeking to develop new natural resource opportunities. Prior to joining MNP, Jason worked as a lawyer and held executive positions in Forest Products Company, the BC Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resources Operations, and Resource Development, Bioenergy, and Indigenous Economic Development. Please help me welcome them to talk to us.
I don't know which way was worse. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having us here, everyone. What wasn't mentioned in the introduction is I am a current member on the board of directors for the Forest Professionals BC. So Forest Professionals BC. The Forest Professionals BC is a regulatory body of all forest professionals in the province. So we are a heavily regulated profession, and the law requires anyone practicing professional forestry to be registered with FPBC. The FPBC, formerly ABCFP, we love acronyms in forestry, is a regulator of the profession, and our mandate is to make sure that the professionals have the tools and training to manage the forest in the best interest of the public. So a strategic vision, I'll add, although I'm on the board of directors for the FPBC, any opinions that I have here are not necessarily reflective of the FPBC, but as me as a professional forester. So a strategic vision puts us focus in the future. It inspires and aligns people with the ability to influence the future. That's forest professionals, First Nations, the public. Creates the ability to identify behaviors and practices that don't align with the vision. Allows the adaptation of relevant metrics. We need to measure what we're doing out there. Alberta doesn't measure their spraying. Hard to improve something if you haven't measured it, right? Let's say publicly. And allows us to go beyond incremental solutions. Incremental solutions are great, but I find that most impactful events or most impactful changes are usually the product of big events, not necessarily incremental steps. Think working from home post-COVID. That was one big event that all of a sudden had everyone working from home. It wasn't an incremental, we would have gotten there maybe to working from home eventually, but probably not in 2 months from January to March or April. And having a strategic vision is a good opportunity for risk identification and management. So this is all applied in the context of sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, a lot of us think of environmental sustainability, but there's also, it's very important to talk about economic sustainability, jobs that support families in multi-generational, in some cases, in small communities and large communities. So the BC forests are managed locally, like I mentioned, small communities a lot of the time. And with the support of appropriate professionals, we can make sure that we improve the resilience of forests. James talked about the beetle and the fires. I'm on the same page. Those are really important things that we need to take into consideration when we talk about a strategic vision and when we talk about wanting forestry to be sustainable for us, but also for our kids and our grandkids. One of the things that just say the industry hasn't done an excellent job at is utilization. So there's a lot of biomass that is not utilized, which is unfortunate. And a lot of it is a numbers game, and that's a whole other presentation in and of itself. But I'll just say part of the vision for the BC forest sector is higher utilization. Of course, if we talk about forestry in BC, we have to talk about Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. We all want to make sure that we can use the forest resources to meet ecological, social, and economic needs. So we talked about it, ecological / environmental, economic, but there's also the social aspect, and that is forest bathing, or the social importance of recreation in forests, right? That's important, and those things are hard to measure, harder to measure than some environmental metrics, and also harder to measure than economic metrics, but the social part of it is important. And yeah, so with increased costs of everything, it's important to recognize the co-benefits of the forest industry. So traditionally, it's been very timber-centric, but there are a lot of other benefits that can come from the forest, including things like to carbon sequestration, actually offsetting carbon emissions, biodiversity, and risk reduction. Our silviculture standards have world-class appreciation. And I have a little story about this. So I was working for a consulting company, and we were hired to do some silviculture surveys to determine the status of a carbon project. A ecosystem restoration project funded in the back end by carbon sequestration, carbon credits. This company is from Holland, a Dutch company. approached us and said, hey, can you do these surveys for us? And we said, yeah, sure. We have a lot of experience doing silviculture surveys. How would you like us to do your surveys? It wasn't public land or crown, as we used to say, crown land. So that company was not necessarily tied to provincial standards. They had flexibility on how they wanted to do. Okay, so how do you want it to be done? Well, we're not really sure. What do you do in British Columbia? Okay, here's the manual, 300 pages, here you go. And they went, wow, you really thought of everything. You provincially, foresters, have really put a lot of thought and research into what you want to measure, how you want to measure it, and the importance of gathering all this data. I tell that story to demonstrate that we have a lot of improvement to do. At the same time, we are in a good place. Our industry is, I'll say, good place in terms of learning and evolving and making sure that we are measuring things to an international standard, where other countries look at us, look at British Columbia, look at forestry in British Columbia and say, wow, you are thinking about what you're doing. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason, talk about a little bit more about the job side of things. Oh boy.
Thanks. I think it's always tricky when you come into a presentation or a seminar and there's, you know, terms like sustainability, and you want to figure out what that means. And here we are talking about sustainable management on the lands. And that is driven in part by the value chain that gets created off the lands. And James talked a little bit about some of the collapse that we've seen in the forest sector over the last 14 years in particular. I'm not going to blame it on the beetles and fires. There's lots of other blame to go around for that. But I do want to think about how we focus on forestry in the future and what a sustainable forest sector looks like in the long term, because I think it goes beyond the products that we're making. Although sustainable wood products are an important aspect of that forestry cycle. The value that we add through forestry doesn't just happen at the end of the value chain. So if you think about all the work that's done from the time that the planning efforts are underway, the time that the infrastructure development is there, the time that the silviculture surveys are being done on the landscape, these are all steps that add value in the sense that we have a better understanding of what's actually out there, better understanding of what our options are to manage it, and what some of the consequences might be for the decisions that we make on the land. And if we're thinking about what we want the future to look like, a sustainable future that is going to be responsive to issues like fire, like climate change, like reconciliation with First Nations, like wildlife management, we've got to be able to think about what are the triple word scores that we can find in the way that we manage forests. And I think James does a great job of identifying that there's a lot of triple word scores that exist with broadleaf plantations, with inclusion of broadleaf, with inclusion of diversity on the landscape in the species that we manage for. When we think about where are the areas that we want to set aside, what do those look like? When we think about where there's the greatest risks of fire and the impacts of those fires, how can we then locate our harvesting activities or co-locate harvesting activities to try and reduce fire risk, as an example of ways that we can look for more sustainable options through our long-term planning in the forest sector. I know that we're really short on time, so I don't want to go through these in too much detail. I'd rather have a discussion. But I do believe that part of the sustainability of path for British Columbia and for British Columbia forestry is about Indigenous reconciliation. And that requires recognizing the underlying ancestral knowledge in relation to traditional territory. It involves understanding the ownership structure that predates and underlies the the former crown system, as Juliet referred to it, the crown land that we often talk about. And it's going to involve more participation. So, part of my vision of sustainable land management in the future, it comes from having more people involved in the decision-making process at a more local level, looking at spatial management versus aspatial management. When James is talking about the AAC and managing to the AAC, I think that, if we have not arbitrary, but if we have abstract numbers and we're managing to abstract numbers, we make different decisions than we make if we're actually looking at an area of land and making decisions about what's the right thing to do on that area of land. And the right thing to do could involve a lot of different things. It could involve thinking about what are the economic consequences of a sustainable timber supply. I don't know if any of you look into the tree frog news clipping services, but today there was a paper that came out from the 3 major unions in BC, talking about the need for a sustainable supply of timber as being one of those elements of something that we need as far as forest policy goes. And again, that's not something that's easy to do in the abstract. That's actually going to require us thinking less aspatially about what are these big numbers like allowable annual cut, and more spatially about what is the forest that we're actually managing, what is sustainable in the long term for that forest, how do we identify the areas that we want to harvest, and put those in place where we're going to create the most benefits and reduce the risk of, reduce the most risk and create the most opportunities for long-term economic development. Full utilization is something I think is really important. If we're going to try and learn from some of our peer countries, I suppose, from a boreal standpoint in Europe. If you go to a place like Finland, biomass is something that's just built into the infrastructure of almost every community, so that there's always an expectation that when you're harvesting for saw logs and pulp logs, you're also harvesting for biomass, and that each community is going to have a biomass system that's going to provide heat and power. Is that always going to be your cheapest source of heat and power? Usually with heat it is, power maybe not, but it's part of having a circular economy that's going to be able to take into account all of these other values on the land base, and reduce what we think of as waste and open burning and some of these other things that are going there. Like James, I believe that we are missing opportunities if we really want to transform the forest sector. Finding a way to work with deciduous supply that we have is something that's critical and requires more research and investment. I did see that there's an announcement today by a company out of Fort St. James called Deadwood that's working with UNBC. They've got a process that they actually use heat and pressure to treat aspen lumber to create a long-lived wood product that can be used for external decking. They're going to use it to build engineered wood products for housing, and it's quite exciting development from local innovators. And it's in partnership with the Nikosley First Nation as well. So, aspirationally, Juliet talked a little bit about setting a vision. I think we need bolder visions when it comes to what sustainable forest management could be in British Columbia and what a sustainable forest sector could be. Just as an example, this is from the University of Maine. This is a 3D printed house that's uses lignin-based resins and wood residue, and it's been fully printed from the ground up. This is a company out of France with the unfortunate moniker of Flying Whales, but they've built a heavy lift, clean burning dirigible that can lift up to 60,000 tons per load. So essentially the same as a logging truck. The idea then that you could go in, you wouldn't need to build roads, you could go log without having the infrastructure that surrounds that. There's been a $30 million investment by the Quebec government to have a manufacturing center built in Montreal. There's agreements with Northwest Territories and Nunavut to bring in supplies in winter into remote regions using this. And so again, I'm not saying that this is the answer, but this is the type of transformative thinking or the type of long-term vision that allows you to skip past what's possible today, think about what the desirable future is, and then figure out how you're going to reverse engineer from that to make better decisions in the current time. And this is why we need to make better decisions. I think, this is really interesting to me. This is the work of Paul Hesburgh, who's my personal hero. He's like the Forestry Indiana Jones, but not like a colonial thief of relics. But if you look at the top photo here, which is a black and white photo from Leecher Mountain, it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but there's a lot of areas that look like maybe they could have been clear cuts or that are mixed in there. And there's a lot of areas where you can kind of see through the tree canopy much more easily than you can in the lower green photo. And this is really because through fire suppression activities over the last 150 years, there's lots of regions like this where we've actually got more trees on the landscape than we've ever had before. And we're creating, there's consequences that flow from that as a result. So, what's important for me in looking at these photos, and I don't know how many of you would identify yourselves as, or self-identify as kind of forestry or forestry adjacent, or whether you'd identify as the general public. I think it's easy to look at forests and forget about timescales and forget that forests are actually changing and dynamic all the time. And often, I find for me, even as a forester in first year forestry, learning about zero stages, learning about the fact that these forests, they progress towards that climax forest. Not many of them reach that, particularly not in the northern interior of BC. Most of them are hit reset by fire before they ever get a chance to express themselves as a climax forest. But we look out the window, or we look out the windshield of our vehicle when we're driving by these forests, and we kind of think, this is what the land has always looked like. This is what the land will always look like. And that's just not the case. But it's our human timescales that prevent us from being able to see these periods of transition. And that goes for, the way that we think about industry as well. Norsask, I think, is an amazing story that I wish we had something like it in BC. This is the largest Indigenous owned sawmill in North America. And an amazing success story of a company that was taken over by a group of nations. They support the economic development of other nations in the forest sector. They've got exceptionally high utilization standards and environmental standards. And again, this is something that when I think about what sustainability looks like, this to me, the local ownership of the resource, where the benefits are being felt in the communities where those local owners come from, is something that's critical when I think about a sustainability story. So my encouragement to everyone here when you're thinking about sustainability is to not think about what would make us like marginally more sustainable in the current context, but how would you actually define sustainability in a future state? If you could hop into that time machine and think about what a sustainable forest sector would look like, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, how different would it be from what it is today? If you were starting with a blank slate, what it look like? I mean, for me, again, it's things like thinking about biomass as being an important and integral part of that cycle. It's thinking about creating as many long-lived wood products from as many different species as we can. It's thinking about ensuring that the benefits of forestry are felt locally. And if we do that, then we can think about what are the steps that we can take to unlock that future, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as locked into a present we're trying to escape from. And just to follow on a great point that Juliet made, BC is a world leader in forest management. It just turns out that being a world leader isn't good enough, and it doesn't mean that we get to stand still. We aren't doing things as well as we need to. We need to be in a process of continuous improvement and learning. And I don't think anybody would say that we're doing all the right things all the time as exists today. And you're never done planning what your strategic vision is. One of my favorite quotes, Mike Tyson: "Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth." And I think when we think about what the forest sector looked like, when we look at all of those investments that were made in spraying, in stand tending, from the 80s, there was an expectation of what the forest, the future of the forest sector was going to look like. And we've taken some punches in the mouth. And so that means that we have to adapt. We have to come up with new plans. We have to keep trying to get better and move towards a longer term vision. Thank you so much.
Dr. Jay Elkin. Dr. Elkin is a forest ecologist whose research focuses on how climate and landscape disturbances interact to influence forest dynamics, landscape connectivity, and the spatial distribution of forest ecosystem services. His research is premised on the idea that by improving our understanding of the ecological processes that drive forest dynamics, we will be better able to predict how the systems will change in the future in response to shifting environmental, climatic, and socioeconomic conditions. More accurately, evaluate the uncertainty associated with future environmental conditions and develop more robust forest management plans. His research evaluates how forest management practices may be modified to increase the long-term ecological and economic resilience of mixed-wood forest systems.
Thank you very much. Nice demonstration that I should rewrite that. That doesn't flow off the tongue whatsoever. Going last here is nice. Get to hear everyone else, but it does mean I'm going to be a little bit time limited. And because of that, I'm going to start off with just kind of making the main points. Hopefully the main points that we have a little bit of discussion on at the end. So there's kind of 4 really big things that I'd like to kind of touch on here. Maybe it's a little bit of a higher level than what we've heard before. The first point that I think I'd like you to think about when we're thinking about sustainability is what sustainability really means at a local and regional level. And the fact that if we're talking about sustainability, I'm going to argue we really need to articulate clearly what that actually is when the rubber hits the road. Second, kind of related to that, is that when we're talking about sustainability, we have to have metrics for assessing whether or not our forest systems or ecological systems are actually allowing us to achieve more sustainable goals. So we need to have quantitative metrics that we're actually following. Third, we must make sure that our sustainable forest management must be based on ecosystem and neighborhood specifics. So basically doing the right thing in the right location. We don't want to have the same type of template that's applied everywhere. And the last thing, which is the thing that I'm actually most interested in, and I'll kind of spend the most time talking about, is that when we're talking about sustainable forestry, and this kind of goes really on what was just being talked about here, we need to think about how we're adapting our forestry practices to make sure that it's both ecologically, socially, and economically more viable. So what I'm going to do is just kind of quickly go through some 3 big points for the third ones here, and then hopefully have a little bit of discussion about what sustainability in the forest sector actually means. So we've all heard sustainable forestry. This is kind of what I'd argue is one of the better, bigger statements of it, used by the UN and FAO, also as part of the PEFC statement on sustainable forest management. I'm sure you've read something very similar to that. It's great. It's kind of articulates what sustainability is, but it's frankly a bunch of arm waving. It's not coming down to what we actually mean in terms of sustainable forest systems. And having those type of articulations or vision statements, I think is good at a regional level. We do want to make sure that sustainability means economically viable, ecologically viable, and socially just. But for this to actually have any teeth, we need to boil that down into what does this mean locally? And when we start doing that, one thing that we have to recognize whenever we're having these debates is that there's going to be trade-offs. If we want to manage for long-term ecological sustainability, that means in this area or in this time, there are going to be trade-offs that we have to make with regard to economic gains that are potentially viable there, and the knock-on effects to some of the social justice that we may be thinking about. Okay, so please think about what's sustainability means and ways that we can actually be better at defining what our management is going for. And at this stage, it's kind of the new normal. We're not managing forests for timber. We're managing forests for many different services. These are provisioning services. These are the carbon thing that we've talked about. These are biodiversity. These are wellness social services. So our management and our statement of the long-term sustainability must incorporate the fact that we are looking for these multiple values all the time. Okay. Now, the second, or I'm sorry, the one final thing that I want to make there is that we have experience doing forestry. We frankly got a lot of experience doing forestry. It's one of the longest professions apart from agricultural that humans have been doing. But we still have a lot to learn, and we want to make sure that our practices are going to be ecologically sound. And what this means is basically we need to know the systems that we're managing and how to manage them better. Right now, ecosystem-based management still is one of the most kind of promoted frameworks for actually managing our forests. And when we're thinking about what that means, ecosystem-based management has kind of grown out of a previous mindset that we're trying to have our harvest systems emulate disturbances. Ecosystem-based management is a bit more of a nuanced take on that. It's now want to think about, well, what are the different ways that we can emulate or at least approximate some of the ways that disturbances shape our ecosystems, and can that be used to drive these systems into more sustainable frameworks in the future? All right, then get into the second big one. And this is something that we kind of relates to what sustainability means, but also means or relates to how we can actually measure it. So when we're thinking about sustainability, we need to have quantitative metrics for actually assessing whether or not we're hitting it. And what this often comes down to is criterion indicators. And these are going to be criterion indicators that go across the spectrum of the economic, of the social, of the ecological, that we want to have maintained, and they have to be related to things that we can actually measure, record, track through our forestry practices. Okay. Although we collect a lot of information, I'm going to argue that we actually do a very poor job of storing it and disseminating it. So yeah, we measure a bunch of things, but we don't have it in a framework where we can actually use that to improve our forestry practices going forward. And kind of just related to this, with this forest information, management information, a really key thing in keeping track of what we're doing is knowing our objectives. So if we don't clearly articulate what our objectives are for a block, for a stand, for a region, then there's no way that we can actually map on what's happening to those systems as we follow them through time to what the initial objectives of that forester was in that area. Okay? It's a bit of a tangent here, but something that's kind of related to this is a lot of our forest certification, where this is hopefully going in the future, is allowing us to do better actually tracking of where our resources are coming from, basically saying that I know where this tree was harvested, I know the product that it's going in, and I can map on to how sustainably that forestry was done based on knowing the pathway that that forest product actually came through. And a lot of technological advancements actually are allowing us, are getting us much closer to that. Now, the third thing that I'd like us to kind of think about and maybe discuss, and again, it's really great from what James was saying, is that we need to think about our forest management as being ecosystem and neighborhood specific. Now, what that means basically is that we need to think about the specific area, the conditions, the constraints of the area that we're working, and make sure that our management and our goals for sustainability map onto what's there. Okay? The area where we're doing prescriptive forestry that kind of blindly applies the exact same silviculture treatment, James, maybe you'd agree with this, that's not good enough anymore. We can't simply do the same thing, same type of harvesting, same type of planting everywhere. In some areas that may be appropriate, but there's many areas where it won't be. And kind of related to that, having standards that we're adhering to that don't actually reflect the heterogeneity that we know occurs in our natural forests is also something that is not sufficient if we want to have a long-term sustainable forest systems. All right. Just cut over that. Basically, the take home is that we should need to be thinking about this across multiple scales. And the last thing that I'll just spend a little bit more time on, if it's okay, is this last part of sustainable forestry and the need for adaptive forestry to possibly drive us to more sustainable forest systems. And the starting point here is we don't know everything. As I mentioned before, we have a long history of doing forestry across the world. When I'm saying that, I'm primarily speaking that from a Eurocentric point of view, where we have 200 years of kind of doing classic European forestry. But that is a long time to learn. You also mentioned that we're dealing with long-lived organisms, so this is maybe one life cycle of a Douglas fir, but in terms of human management, we have been doing this for a while. We need to keep that up, and we need to keep on using the perspective that we need to learn from our successes and from our failures. And the only way that we can do that is by actually keeping track of what we're doing to our forests through time and evaluating, are they progressing in a way that adheres to these criteria and indicators that we're using for defining whether or not it's sustainable, right? So that's the first thing, learn from what you do. And the second thing, which again, I think everyone here has touched on, the world is changing. For good, for bad, it's going to change. It's changing for a whole range of reasons. The one that is above everything, I'm going to argue, is climate change. It's driving a lot of what's happening in a lot of ecological systems, but there's also changes in our economic systems. There's changes in how we actually want to use wood products. These all have feedbacks in terms of how we actually manage our forest systems. And a way that we can kind of think about this is the different type of stressors and how those stressors are going to be changing. If we're going to have more drought in the future, if we're going to have more heat domes, those are going to put direct ecological impacts on our forest systems, and we potentially want to manage for that, which then raises the question, how do we do that? How do we actually make our systems so that they are not going to be as negatively impacted ecologically, economically, socially with these changes that are going forward? Range of different ways that we can think about that. One of the main ones that was being talked about for a long time, but is currently very much in vogue, is talking about forest resilience, ecosystem resilience. So if we know that we're in a time of changing environments, changing ecological stressors, one of the ways that we can make sure those systems are going to be around, provide the services we want in the long term, is try to push them into a more resilient state, such that they will be not as negatively impacted by these changes, current and future, that we expect to happen. Okay, and that leads into something that's a little bit more close to my heart, which is we need to figure out how to do that. One of the projects that we're actually doing here at UNBC to kind of promote this is participating in an international project called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Project. And this was set up basically to kind of hit on what I was just talking about. We know that forest systems likely have to change in order to maintain sustainability in the future. And we want to look at how forestry practices can increase the resilience, resistance of those systems to future changes. Now, I won't go into too much detail here, but basically the premise is when we're looking at a forest system, we want something from it. We want to get wood. We want to get biodiversity. We want to make sure that our species composition is going to be relatively similar or relatively constant. That's great. Unfortunately, the world's changing. So instead of having this nice steady state equilibrium of that forest being the same, there's likely going to be changes. What we then want to do is ask, can we modify our forest management such that we see less of an impact on our system based on these climate shifts? And the framework that this takes is basically looking at 3 different options that do slightly different things. So managing for resistance, this would be saying, well, we want to do management that tries to push our forest towards a state where it's not going to be as negatively impacted by that heat dome. We're still going to have the forest cover there. We're still going to be getting what services we want from the forest with having minimal impacts. So making it more resistant to those external pressures that they're facing. The second framework that we could use is increasing resilience. We know there's going to be impacts. We know that we have a heat dome when we've got really bad drought years coming 2-3 years in a row. It's going to have an impact. We're going to see mortality of some of our subalpine fir, some of our aspen is going to die. But can we manage in a way that the system recovers to provide the timber, provide the biodiversity we want more in the long term? And finally, another framework that we can consider would be transition. And this is where we know we have very good models that project that the climate is going to be increasing by 2 degrees over the next 60 years. What we want to do is potentially pre-adapt our forest systems so that they're going to be better able to survive, produce the services we want in those futures that we know are coming down the track. All right. So these are all good kind of big grandiose things, but we really need to figure out what that means on the ground. And that's the whole framework of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change trials. These are operational scale trials. We're actually implementing different ways of doing this and then following what that means for maintaining the forest systems in the longer term. So the one that we've set up here is at the John Prince Research Forest, one of the research forests at UNBC here. Myself, Sue Granger, the head of the John Prince Research Forest, and Kristen Warning are kind of the leaders of this one ask installation. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't just pie in the sky science. This is operational level forestry. So it's done at a large enough scale. Each of our treatments is 10 hectares. It's not a big block, but it's a big enough block that we can actually do realistic forestry operations and look at what that means. It's still a science though, so we're doing replicates of these different treatments, allowing us to actually assess how the different treatments influence our forest ecosystems, timber production, a whole range of things that we're concerned with. Just to kind of wrap this up, John Prince facing a lot of kind of climate stresses that we are right around Prince George here, increased summer and winter temperatures, a suggestion that we're going to shift away from the SPS as being the Beck zone, what that is kind of defines the ecosystem, increased amount of drought stress, increases altered site hydrology, changes in fire regimes, changes in what the insect pressures are going to be facing as well. So these are things that we want to try to make the system more resistant, resilient, or allow it to better adapt to these future stresses. Okay, I won't go through all of these, but basically what I'd like you to take away from this is starting from the premise of we want to adapt our systems to make them more resistant. So going back to how I was mentioning before, we need to be very explicit about what that means. So to do that, we actually created or had large workshops, 3-day workshops, where we got together a bunch of really smart people from academia, from the forest sector, from community groups that came and said, well, what do we actually want to manage for if we're going to manage for increasing resistance? What we came up with was actually preserving the current species richness, but shifting it towards a more historic distribution. And the reason that we were doing this, is that in the areas where this work was being done, there was a history going back to the 1950s, 1960s of diameter limit logging, which I think I'm speaking to a lot of people with forest backgrounds here, but if you're not, diameter limit logging is basically going in, grabbing the big trees that are most economically viable, taking them out, and basically leaving everything else. So what that does is it really shifts this, or it can really shift the species composition. And in this case, it really shifted the species composition to having a much higher percent of subalpine fir compared to the Douglas fir and the spruce that was probably historically a little bit more prevalent. We're concerned about fire here. So the idea was if we shift this to more of a Douglas fir leading stand, that's going to make it more resistant to fire events, more resilient in that way. So in addition to that, management, increase stand vigor, improve forest health, maintain enhanced forest structure, the age diversity, make sure that we're including large diameter spruce and Douglas fir. So those are our objectives. Those are the things that we're aiming for. That's then translated into the specifics of how we can actually manage that, the strategic, the actual operations on the ground. And you can see this was actually the harvest operation that was done in 2021 using a forwarder system there. Forget what experiment we're actually looking at there. I'm pretty sure that's a transition treatment in the top where we actually see the machine. In the bottom one here, this is one of the resistance treatments. So I'll basically wrap it up there. But the point being, if we're trying to manage for sustainability, you have to have clear definitions of what you're managing for. Those clear definitions of what you're managing for need to be translated into the operational practices that we're actually going to be using. And that's what we're trying to learn right now here and other places throughout the province. So with that, maybe we can have a bit of a discussion.
Awesome. All right. So now is the time for questions from the audience. Yes.
So I think it's generally being acknowledged that the species tree around here that is fastest growing, most has the most, encourages most biodiversity, has the best hydrologic creates the most best hydrologic conditions would be deciduous.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, it is, right?
Yeah,
Aspen is the fastest
We need to be
growing.
careful with Beth hydrological. So Aspen are basically water pumps. So they are very good at utilizing water. If we're looking at soil moisture and changing soil moisture through drought events, you want to be careful here, but they do suck up a lot of moisture. So they're good at using water, but they transpire, the evapotranspiration from Aspen stands is really, really high. That can be good, it can be bad. Again, it comes down to where we're actually managing for it and be thoughtful of. And James, maybe you want to speak to that as well.
Well, actually, I deleted a slide from my presentation. I kind of went over some of those evapotranspiration studies and. I think in one of those, the DeBile study, like they've compared the annual transpiration of aspen versus conifer, and it's about the same. So the conifer would start sucking up water earlier in the season and later, right? So then the aspen has more of it. They do suck up more water when they're fully greened up, but it's a shorter period of the year. And then that's counterbalanced by the more precipitation that gets through there. So that one slide I showed of the rainfall interception, it's like 0.
And that's a great point, and that it's highly seasonal dependent as well. So we've got some installations up in northern BC where we actually are monitoring soil moisture in a pure conifer stand and in a mixed wood stand. And it really depends on whether or not you have that drought event in May, June, or in the middle of summer, depending on what's actually going on. So aspen are good at moving water, whether that's good for the forest system, that depends on what you're actually looking for. But they are very good at that.
Right, and they also have, as James said, increased albedo. There's more shade, improved soil fertility.
Yep.
Right, under evergreens or conifers, you've got an acidic soil generally. So there's so many positive aspects to deciduous. It still seems that we're not actively pursuing that, we still have the forest mentality or the forest industry mentality, planting more conifers. And
Do you know of any planting deciduous?
they've actually tried to plant deciduous and they haven't been very successful.
No, I was just making the point that you're 100% correct. We don't really plant deciduous. It is still treated as a weed species.
There's some of the hybrid stuff down in the Fraser Valley that was done, hybrid poplar.
Just to her point there, I didn't make this point in the presentation, but if we stop, like right now, I think we're doing about 18% of the annual amount we harvest is getting brushed and sprayed in BC, or maybe actually it was 18% in 2008. I think we're down to 14% now. So if we stop brushing and spraying, like we're talking about a pretty small amount of the land base, where you'd still have conifer domination on probably 85% of the cut blocks. So I mean, really, it's not a real threat to the economy. And then if you add in the fact that it's probably less likely to burn, we're pretty sure, it's probably a net benefit to the.
Well, it grows twice as fast.
And
as
it grows,
well.
and you're not even looking at it.
And if you stopped planting conifers, you could basically just, in Newfoundland, they don't plant trees. They actually just thin the balsam that's coming back, right? Because it comes back 50,000 cents per hectare. So, when you get out to some of these cut blocks around here, and what comes back is aspen. You wouldn't have to plant a thing. You could actually just thin the aspen and you'd have a productive forest at no cost to the taxpayer.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure if we've got the markets for aspen.
Well, but I mean, so McMillan or Weyerhaeuser has a plant in Edson that makes OSB. They have a plant in Kenora that makes parallel beams and panels. These are economic, and the whole criteria in BC is so out of whack. So in some areas, like around here, aspen's considered a weed tree, but in Dawson Creek, it's actually considered a commercial species. So it's just because the local mills have decided what they want, right? It has no bearing to what the environment can actually produce.
Is that a question at the back?
Oh, I was just gonna add, so we're talking about biodiversity, I think we need to mention that it's not just chasing for the it's the species richness, it's also the species evenness. And right now, the caribou is very uneven and they're thriving for lichens. Actually, they're the caribou ungulated winter range in Mackenzie that specifically indicated that we need brush management in the ungulated winter range modified harvest zone, that we have to maintain less than 8% of the forest as a not suitable for moose. So like you kind of have to manage your brush species just for the sake of the caribous. And I know we can talk about like, you know, reduce our AEC, stop harvesting this area, but this timber harvest in Mackenzie, so-called Milltown, it's not just important for the communities in Mackenzie, but it's also for the indigenous groups in there. With Arsha, with Obo, with the CTS, Seike with Conifex and Kenneford, Dunkley, and Takla with what's that?
Hampton,
What's that?
is it Hampton?
Takla Nation with the forgot the licensees. Saskatchewan, yeah. So they're super important. Like Seike has their own harvesting Chucho industry, Chucho Forestry. We call it Lake Indian Band, they have industrial. So they're important not just for the community in Mackenzie, but they're important for the local First Nation groups too. And then that ungulated winter range is really like a middle ground, so you can come harvest, but you have to deactivate your roads, so wolf can have trouble on those. And you have to, you know, do the brush management. Try to reduce the moose population because the moose caribou wolf dynamic. So I just want to bring up this idea, and I'm really curious about your thoughts too for this brush management to increase the species evenness.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on that. So there's the Hubble Lab, they've been putting cameras on caribou up in the Arctic. And they discovered that 54% of their summer diet is actually broadleaf. There's videos of them like eating aspen, the caribou eating aspen up there. And apparently the aspen wasn't showing up in the pellets because it was so thoroughly digested. So a lot of the assumption that caribou don't eat aspen or other broadleaf is kind of, it's disputed. So I think we're like the brush control to help caribou. I think it's not necessarily because caribou don't eat aspen or the other brush. I think it's more like the goal is to reduce moose numbers, I think. So I don't, and if moose is the problem, then maybe predator control is more useful than, hammering important deciduous species. It probably helped the caribou as well. There was a good study for that, the Mackenzie sighting, or the Kennedy sighting herd. And they looked at the caribou use of the different forest types, and the caribou used deciduous forest types. Like it was the same as spruce. So this idea that aspen and caribou are incompatible, I don't necessarily buy it.
I don't think that's what you were saying though, but it's about trying to deal with the complex of species and how they interact with each other, right? So, and caribou are poor competitors. When we think about poor competitors in a forest landscape, we think about things like pine. When we think about poor competitors from a wildlife perspective, we think about things like caribou, right? So they tend to get outcompeted by deer and by moose, and then the deer and moose tend to bring in wolves, support higher wolf populations. But then wolves will preferentially predate caribou because they're just not as good at getting away from wolves as deer and moose. So you see that transition of wildlife populations over there. But I think the important thing, and I think Chan and I are singing from the same songs sheet. My sheet just has Mike Tyson on it too. But this notion of like we need to manage forests as forests, taking into account what the objectives are for wildlife, for tree species mixes, for hydrology, for economic drivers of local communities, for traditional uses of First Nations. And these are decisions that actually need to be made, spatially on the ground in relation to specific forests, as opposed to prescribing any one solution without taking into account all the interests that are there on the land base.
Awesome. So, we have, first, we have a question on the chat first, and then I'll go to the questions in the audience. Are deciduous logs traded between licensees? Are pure deciduous logs traded between licensees? It seems likely not much, as currently non-OSB manufacturers avoid pure coniferous and leave it standing in mixed stands. And that's a question from Peter Furlong.
Sorry, and this is the last part.
It seems likely not much, as currently non-OSB manufacturers avoid pure coniferous and leave it standing in mixed stands.
Deciduous, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean, there are
oh, sorry.
a few deciduous licenses out there in the piece in particular, but it's going to depend on having a consumer of OSB or a producer of OSB as a consumer of your deciduous logs primarily. I know that there are local mills that have experimented with cutting lumber with aspen, but it's you know, it would be interesting to see. Again, you've got a 20-year kind of cycle that you could do with the aspen, but you'd almost want to see like what could you do if you did stand tending on an aspen stand to produce saw log quality aspen. What would that look like? You're not necessarily going to find it in natural run or mixed stands that are going to meet particularly high recovery rates of quality lumber, which is a problem when you're looking at trying to commercialize that as an opportunity.
Yep.
I just responded to the question, the deciduous logs on the major licensee cut blocks are traded to the pellet companies.
Yeah.
So Meadowbank would take deciduous logs from, say, a Canfor cut block. So just, yeah, they are traded, but unfortunately not for actually wood products.
Awesome. And Peter said that, thanks. I think if a market is made for deciduous, it will be less frowned upon and acceptable. Cool. Great. So we had 2 questions from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not a forester, and so this is all pretty interesting to me, but
You like to be?
no. But I think that's really what it makes me kind of ask the question in terms of, I mean, this is very interesting, and I think the general public should know more about, you know, sustainability and how I think there's a lot of benefits. So I mean, you talk about the social, ecological, and environmental benefits, but my concern is when we talk about objectives and then being quantitative and these metrics, it's, you know, first of all, you know, who is deciding what matters most and who is deciding what these objectives are. Because I think, again, you know, in the general public doesn't really know enough about this. And I mean, I'm not hearing a lot from the forest sector as a whole in terms of, you know, all these different benefits. We hear a lot, I mean, in Prince George in particular, people identify as this being a forestry town. I mean, but yet, you know, our biggest employers are actually, you know, healthcare and education. So how do you, I would like to know what your thoughts are on changing that narrative. So if we want to have these big, you know, pie in the sky ideas that I think are really important, and I think that's where we need to look at long term. How do you see us making, you know, short term, you know, steps towards getting the public more involved and talking about these really, really important different services, you know, that the forest provides. It's not just about timber. I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Well, I think you're hitting on if I can start, one of the main things is just outreach. So as an academic, we need to do outreach on terms of the work that we're doing and illustrate that, yeah, these are things that we're thinking about. And we're investing a lot of our research time, a lot of research dollars in it in order to understand how forest ecosystems are doing better. That's the side that I'm most familiar with. I'm going to argue that across the board, that type of outreach needs to take place as well. From the forest sector side, from any type of lobby group that is doing it. What do you want? Be clear about it. I'm a real big fan of quantitative stuff, because if it's not quantitative, then it's basically arm waving. So we want to be able to have a clear, transparent way of discussing what you're going for. And the easiest way of doing that is really having clear criteria and indicator that you're good at. So I fully appreciate what you're saying. There needs to be more communication of what we're managing for, how the management that we're doing supposedly gets us there. And we need to be we should be very clear about what the trade-offs are. That's something that is just not nearly talked about enough. If we want to have more biodiversity, great. There is going to be an impact to that. If we want to have more saw logs, there's going to be an impact to that. There's not a right or wrong, but we need to be explicit that there is going to be trade-offs, whatever pathway we decide to go. And that's part of this conversation. I think I'm hearing you say we need to start having.
I think it's awesome that you're here and you're interested as a non-forester. I'll be interested to get feedback on what made sense and what didn't make sense and how we can communicate better, because I think one of the changes that's happened recently is we used to have the Association of BC Forest Professionals, and now it's the BC Forest Professionals. And other than changing the acronym, the real difference is it's gone from being an association that kind of had an advocacy agenda and a public facing agenda to one that's almost purely regulator and doesn't have that same role anymore. Which means, and I'm looking at my former students in the room, that, for those of us who are or become foresters, we have a responsibility to educate the public. That's one of the things that we have to do to talk about forestry, to talk about why we make the decisions that we're making, to talk about and make explicit those trade-offs that have to be there. And I think that, for the 75 years of the association's existence, foresters probably mostly got to work in the shadows, and then they got to hide behind the apron strings of the association. And now we're kind of being pushed out to be able to say that let's have these conversations. Also, just like to point out that there are underway the forest landscape planning tables that are being established all over the province. I think there's 13 of them now. Is that John? Right? Yeah. And they're at various stages of progress, but they're about exactly what you're talking about. They're about changing the decision making to make it more local, to make it more inclusive, and to create opportunities to engage not on just reviewing a plan that's a fait accompli put forward by a licensee, but actually have a say in how the values of the community, the values of the people who live and work and play in the forest and traditional territory, how they want to see their future.
The decision-making structure is changing, and the forest landscape plans are a huge part of that. I have colleagues who are at the table for those forest landscape planning meetings. Everybody's there, all the nations, local communities, licensees, everyone's there. And you're talking about managing an area that's 1.5 million hectares. It's huge. And there's a lot of different interests that need to be considered. So the decision-making structure is changing, and there is a lot of data available. It's not super accessible, which someone mentioned, but it is there. So if you are data savvy, there's the BC data catalog, and there's a lot of things there. Roads, riparian, wildlife habitat, harvest volumes, harvest areas, trappers, guides, just a ton of data out there, historical, current, and planning wise. So it's there. Outreach, events like this, is a start. Writing to the local paper. We live in an age where information is available. And I think the public is getting more interested in forestry, especially as, like you said, PG identifies largely as a forestry town. And so what happens when the mills start curtailing? Here, Fraser Lake, Houston, people start going, okay, well, why? And what are the alternatives? And unfortunately, those huge impactful events are one of the drivers of conversation of, how are we going to move forward?
I just wonder, just to that point, we hear though, Canfor, so when we have these big mill shutdowns, the narrative, anecdotally is not, we need to do a better job of managing our forests. It's, we're losing jobs, and it's a softwood lumber. We need to, cut the red tape and let us, cut more, and this is government, and you hear, like, it to me, and again, I'm not a forester. But, this is the conversation that's being had in the community, because I think people feel the threat to their livelihoods. And so when we think about, all these different services that it provides, that's, I think the challenge is that generally, a lot of it's this economic piece, because there's not an alternative that's being discussed in terms of these are ways that we can transition. Canfor tends to dominate a lot of that narrative. And they're very good at lobbying government for support. And of course, we don't always have the same government in place too. So I mean, these are some of the things that I think in terms of when we're looking long-term in our communities and, our region. I would just hope, for future current foresters that we be thinking about that.
We always have the same bureaucracy, Nicole.
Yeah.
And I think my thought on that issue is, this concept of the trade-off that Dr. Elkin talked about, that we're gonna do this, well, we're gonna lose this. So I think the point of my presentation was that it's a bit of a false kind of thing that we're presented with, it's not really working, like, oh, we wanna get more jobs, well, we gotta do this, we gotta grow more pine plantations, but there's the consequence to that, like, those don't necessarily have staying power, like, they're not necessarily gonna provide us with jobs down the road. So I think that's something we have to be careful about when we talk about these trade-offs and these, these consequences. If we do want to protect more forests, we're gonna lose all these jobs. Well, there's, that's also a bit of a false trade-off, because if you look at, maybe the problem is these super mills, maybe the problem is we have too efficient of a, that's a real tough one to argue, but I would argue, we should go back to these smaller, more inefficient mills that made money, they were profitable. I mean, you can make money with the wood miser, I know that. You just don't have the opportunity to do it because these big companies have locked up the timber supply. So I think that's another big question is, these political questions, it's not really even, it's not a question for forestry, academia, it's a question for policy and politicians and trade agreements, and investor protection laws that we've signed on with the World Trade Organization. It's a huge problem. We're not gonna solve here.
It is tricky, and I think we're probably not great communicators, like, we were tree whisperers, that we're actually good at talking to people. When you look at the job situation, often it's not about whether or not there's enough trees to actually supply the mill. It's just whether or not you can get those trees to the mill in a way that's timely, and you can plan in a predictable way for the flow of logs that's going to come off the forest. And we are at this kind of inflection point from a policy standpoint, from a bureaucracy standpoint, in the way that we access that potential timber supply in the forest as well. So, a lot of the challenges, and whether it's Houston or whether it's Fraser Lake or whether it's the pulp mills, is actually, can you get the permits within enough time to allow you to plan to bring the logs in to continue to supply the mill. And that does become an economic question. Generally the amount of timber harvested falls underneath what the AAC is by usually 20%, and you see that track pretty well over time. And last year we saw it drop to about 40% of the AAC, down from where it's usually 80%. So there was a huge harvest reduction last year. Some of that is related to the lumber markets. They came off these ridiculously record highs during COVID, where nobody's quite sure why people were paying so much as they were for lumber, but I guess they enjoyed it while it lasted, and now they're kind of hovering at what would have used to have been about a break even, and when you look at the impacts of inflation, is no longer a break even for those. And maybe there are different economic models out there, but are there going to be? There are still trade-offs with those if you're thinking about how many wood misers could you actually have out there operating. An infinite number of wood misers out there operating, I'm sure. But those are some of the trade-offs too. And I bristle inwardly at this talk about protecting forests, because generally we talk about protecting forests, we're talking about protecting them from human development, but what are we protecting them for in a time of climate change, catastrophic fire events? And it's not just pine plantations, because we don't have, we're just starting to get some of those mature pine plantations coming online. It's natural forest systems that have seen, where we're seeing these decreases in precipitation year over year, or intense precipitation at certain points of the year, where we're in a drought situation across most of Canada in what should be the middle of winter. And we're likely to have another extreme fire season this year across the country. Where I believe that we do need forest management. We need forest management that reflects the interests of the people who live near the forest, that reflect the economic needs, that reflect the social needs, and reflect the environmental reality that we're in. We can't keep doing the things that we've done and expect different or better results. That's for sure.
Sorry, there was one question from this, sorry, it's going in order. And I think this should be just one last question because it's coming up to time, and we can continue having, discussions afterwards when we have pizza, for example. So no worries, there's plenty of time. Yes.
Okay. I don't even know if this is a question, and hopefully I can articulate it well. With all the recent wildfires for the last couple of years, everywhere gone in BC, and even like west of Williams Lake, where it's a lot of like fir and like ponderosa of pine and rolling grass hills and ranch land and stuff. They had like a big fire there for the last couple of years. And what I know is in every single fireplace, they plant pine. So is this going to be our future of forestry in all these burned areas? Is there going to be pine in every single one of these burned areas, knowing that, they don't sequester as much carbon, they create the albedo effect, for example, and that we do need like deciduous for like water content, for example. Do you guys know about that, or?
So it's a question of what are we doing or what should we be doing?
Maybe both.
So what are we doing? It's still dominated by that. There is getting big shifts, but each of you may be able to speak this a little bit more clearly. My understanding that still is the modus operandi of most of our planting is even aged pine dominated. Going forward, I'm expecting to see a change in that. And this is kind of it can be driven by a lot of things that we're discussing here, that we want to have more diverse forests, that there's a lot of benefits to having those more diverse forests, and that they will increase the long-term resilience of these systems to things like drought, to things like fire.
Yeah, I mean, there's a much longer conversation that we could have about about serial stages, about how you identify what the appropriate trees are to plant in ecosystem. Pine is planted because it is a pioneer species. It does well outside of cover. It does well in dry environments, and it's consistent with what's ecologically there on the landscape. And I think that there's a correlation versus causation problems. It's not necessarily that pine was planted there, and so that's why fires burn there. Pine is adapted to fire-based ecosystems, so you'll often see pine come back in fire, in natural regrowth after fire anyway, because you've got what are called serotinous cones. They've got pitch on them. The fire melts the pitch, causes the seeds to come out, and so those are the first trees to germinate after a fire in traditionally fire-dominated ecosystems. And so, if you have areas where you've got expanses of natural pine anyway, it's probably because you've got a fire return period of less than 100 years in a lot of circumstances. And it's not necessarily, yes, I believe that there's room for aspen and for mixed stands, but it's not, I'm also not sure that we should be in the process of necessarily that we can make those decisions alone without looking at the specific landscape and what the appropriate trees are to plant in those areas.
I guess my comment would be where they're planting those pine, it was probably a salvage log burn. Did they salvage log that area?
Yeah, I mean, they did go in and salvage log, but they also planted a lot of like the grasslands that
Oh,
got
they
burned.
were, oh, yeah.
So it's like both, where, it seemed like wherever there was a forest fire, they just planted trees. I imagine some were, just natural pine coming up, but they, you know, you could see the little blue flags wherever they planted. right?
Plastic,
So on the grassland and wherever they salvaged.
Yeah, they also gotta stop littering plastic. Plant trees, but, you know, the Douglas fir would probably have a better success rate if you hadn't salvage logged it, like they get that the extra cover from all the burnt standing timber and, you know, the stuff that falls over, you get little micro kind of spots with shade and shelter that can help those Douglas firs survive, so, you know, some of the salvage logging of these burns is devastating. I mean, Jennifer, you know, the bobtail burn, you've seen what they've done there. I mean, you had really nice regenerating aspen, pine, Douglas fir areas, and when they went in and we salvage logged it, we destroyed all that. Some of the stuff was like 6 feet tall and all got bulldozed. And now they're pine, they planted it all back to pine, and you've got way less diversity than the natural stuff that was growing right after the fire, so. You know, to answer your question, you know, we shouldn't be salvage logging the burns like we are. You know, it should be a lot more selective and a lot more effort, you know, if they do really feel they need to salvage log these burns. They need to make a way bigger effort to leave debris. And that's the other like double-edged sword of this idea of getting rid of debris as a fire risk. Like that's a big argument to get rid of the debris is because it will burn in a forest fire. But on the other hand, that debris can help the non-pine stuff grow. Can help the spruce, and especially the Douglas fir. I really miss the Douglas fir. I really, you know, I see a lot of these Douglas fir stands getting logged around town, and it's all getting replaced with lodgepole pine. You know, and I appreciate the point that Jason's making about, you know, some of the natural cycle would probably favor the pines, but you know, the natural cycle also creates opportunities for the Douglas fir, especially underneath the deciduous, which also is an entirely natural part of these burns. I mean, go up to the bobtail burn, a lot of that stuff is never logged. It's entirely natural response to forest fire, and it's aspen dominated. There's so much aspen growing in the bobtail burn that it's incredible. And of course, we're getting rid of it and planting pine. There's money this year through the Forest Investment Program through the Ministry of Forests, the Chief Forester's Office. And they're not forthcoming with the maps, but they're going to be spending a whole bunch of public money this year, brushing cut blocks that aren't a crown obligation or corporate obligation to grow pine plantations. It's ongoing, government's doing it. Nothing we say makes a difference.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, if it's very quick.
Okay, thanks. So a couple things, or a couple questions. I am worked in the bush in the 80s and 90s. I do have a forestry background, so I worked all the sides, ministry, corporate, contracting, all that stuff, mostly in subculture. So my questions would be, I've been out of it for 15 or 20 years. I haven't worked in the industry for that long, but is the free growing definition still the same as it was 25 or 30 years ago? Because you were saying that you can do this and you're doing this and you're doing all these things to make it better. But if the free growing definition is still the same as it was 25 years ago, then that's probably the problem and something that should be fixed. One of the things I'd like to mention is that we're all talking about jobs and it's all about harvest and it's all about making money and it's all about all those things. But if you think about it, the whole beetle kill thing happened 25 or 30 years ago. What was the AAC before that happened? Because during all those beetle years, we ramped up production and we had way more sawmills, way more pulp mills. But before that, was it sustainable back then? Was that the number that we need to get back to? Because I would like to say that I think that our corporations took advantage and went for it and did what they could to make as much money as possible. And that, of course, it's gonna have to go back to where it was before. If it was sustainable 25 or 30 years ago before the beetle thing, it's gonna definitely not be sustainable AAC levels now. And the other thing is when you say we, who's doing the work? Because when I worked for the company, the whole goal was to get a plantation to pre-growing as fast as you could. So you would plant, you would already have the herbicide spray plan to do within 2 years of planting.
And if you could get that free growing plantation to free growing in 5 to 7 years, it wasn't the company responsibility anymore. So I would submit that the only way to really enforce and make change happen is to change who owns it, who's gonna do the work. If it's the licensee, it's gonna be all about the economics, it's gonna be all about, and they made a killing, like, they got to take stumpage and reduce it for every little bit of money they spent, which left us with no money to do our own stuff. So if the we is gonna be the Ministry of Forests now, or where are they gonna get the money from to do stand tending and thinning and all these things? So I wonder if it's time to do all the sustainable stuff, if we have to take back the forests and make it not be the licensee that gets to reap the benefits, and make it more publicly funded, and they log and they pay full stumpage, and that full stumpage helps us do a much better job at forest management, because our goal is not to make money for shareholders. Our goal as the public and the ministry would be to get as much value out of that resource as possible. And the last thing I want to mention is that if you foresters can start thinking about it, aspen doesn't have to be loggable. You keep talking about how it's not a commercial species, blah, blah, blah. Get away from the harvest. What about the segregation? Isn't everybody wanting carbon credits now? Why couldn't we grow aspen and, you know, count it as carbon credits? And maybe it doesn't have to be logged. Maybe it can stay there and add to the forest and the biodiversity. If you're growing it to just log it, you're just taking away the biodiversity again. So that's my question, but anyway, who is the we? Like, are you guys looking at that? Is the licensee system gonna change in the future? Is there any possibility?
There's a broadleaf working group that includes the government, Ministry of Forests, British Columbia, and First Nations, and some private stakeholders, private mill owners that are looking at the change in the silviculture standards and the free to grow standards. Because it doesn't really make sense anymore.
Well, it's been the same for 35, 40 years.
Right, but it's changing. And as we know, it's unfortunately sometimes change can be slow, unless there's, you know, a giant event that pushes the change all of a sudden. And this might be we might be in the midst of that. So I can say that it is changing. The we that is the decision makers, the we that is measuring the trees. I would say right now, if you follow everything down the line, it ultimately is the provincial government who is making the decisions, and professional foresters and the forest professional species regulatory body, we don't make those decisions. Our job is to follow the law and make sure that forest professionals are following the law and have the tools that they need to make decisions as professionals, so that professional development, access to resources, so that they can act in the best interest of the public and not feel pressure from external forces. And again, following the law is the main thing. Following the law and acting in the best interest of the public. The carbon credits. It's happening. I work on carbon credit projects. It's happening. It's slow. There's not any existing tenure that is manage the forest for carbon credits. Though the fires out west, Prince George, are actually creating an interesting opportunity for some First Nations that hold woodland First Nation woodland licenses, which are area-based tenure. So that makes it a lot easier to propose carbon projects. So the ministry, the Office of the Chief Forester, their carbon and climate services division is currently working on a bridging system, a gap bridging system from what we have now to what carbon specific tenure will be in 5, maybe even 10 years. So they're putting together packages that say, okay, if you have an area-based tenure, you can use a special use permit and this and this and this and a bunch of different documents to propose a carbon project. And in the case of First Nations woodland licenses, it's actually a perfect place because, as we know, First Nations are reclaiming their rights to their land. And it's, in that sense, it's a good tool. And I believe in carbon credits and that has a lot of problems. They've been in the news for probably all the wrong reasons earlier or middle of last year. But it's the criticism that the market is getting is good. It means that people care. People want quality credits. And building on carbon credits, there's also biodiversity credits. So when we talk about moving forward, when mill closures and we losing jobs and how can we move forward, I don't necessarily mean going back to what we're doing and move forward like that, or continuing to move forward harvesting. Rather, what innovative ways are there so that we can get economic benefit from the forest without necessarily having to harvest? So carbon credits, biodiversity credits, right? If we can keep some economic benefit for the society, for the communities, I think that's good. And these are all the right questions. And I think, again, as we're living in an age of information, you can look these things up. People have a voice, the public has a voice. Social media has enabled the, you know, the commoners, if you will, the commoners to be able to express what we feel and what we're experiencing and connect with that, not just, okay, here are the giant companies, they have all the dollars, they own all the advertising, and their opinion is the only one that gets considered. So I would encourage everyone to look into the alternatives of forests and their ability to generate economic benefit, because it goes far beyond milling.
All right, thank you. Okay, so recognizing that people online cannot join in afterwards for discussion, I'm just going to quickly read a comment from Alex here. That we should also talk about what we should not cut. We need to keep some ancient forests, not cut them to turn them into wood pallets being burned in England as sustainable fuel. And with that, let us conclude this formal Q&A session, and